Really grateful for this moment and opportunity to share with you a reflection. Oftentimes when we think of reflection as a moment of deep silence, sometimes breathing in deeply, flattening our feet and meditating, and often confining ourselves in our own body. But what do you do when the world around you has already been confined? What do you do particularly when everything else has seemed to be stifled, still, and no longer moving? It almost seems like a figment of our imagination that all of these things have caused us to be in constant reflection. And so maybe it's time for us to figure out for a moment how to get reacclimated. Reacclimated not only to ourselves, but reacclimated to what enchants us. Yes, enchantment. Probably a word that we don't talk about a lot. And to be re-enchanted by the very things that make us human. It is not the job that has made us. It is not clearly the day-to-day activities that we have mundanely done. It is technically the re-enchantment of our human ingenuity. It is technically the enchantment of our imagination. It is also our instinct and our will to be available and sometimes vulnerable. I myself, as a person who has faced our challenges, like many of you, or some of you, I embark on constantly creating moments of re-enchantment. Moments in which I can fall in love with learning the magic in myself. Magic might not be a normal thing for most of us, but when we think about the re-enchantment of the imagination, our minds can go absolutely wild. And the very moment that we feel that we have to be confined is the moment where we have a little bit of movement. And we have a little bit of hocus pocus. And we've got a little bit of alakazam. It's that re-enchantment that allows for us to break every spellbinding situation. It's the moment where the magic becomes real because we have decided to share in human connection. And we have decided to be resilient. And we have decided to endure. It is there that our creativity begins to be shaken up. Because now, the things that have become routine have to transform into ritual. A ritual is something very different. It is reflective. It is grounding. It makes us steadfast when everything else seems chaotic. Where the routine is an expected idea or pattern that we may move through. The ritual grounds us and holds us again and reminds us of our strength. It reminds us of our courageousness. It reminds us of our brilliance. And it allows for us to feel even more empowered than before. We're then re-enchanted with ourself and our human nature. We then rise to the occasion to celebrate not only ourselves, but others. I've been looking on YouTube and social media, and I've been looking all throughout Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and I've seen the beauty of the human spirit rising up with music and song. I've seen, of course, lately DJs playing non-stop, endless sounds of music, where everyone, such as Michelle Obama to Bernie Sanders and others, have rejoiced in dancing and made commentary. That is the sound of re-enchantment. That is the sound of human intellect. That is the sound of being reconnected. Reconnected because our human spirit says we will be present, we will be connected, and we matter. This time, this present time, may be uncontrollable. It may leave us with a lot of unknowns. But the re-enchantment is about knowing ourselves. Knowing ourselves and how we operate within these moments of chaos. Knowing how we strategically plan and set ourselves up to be healthy, happy individuals, and operating from the collective of our community. And deep listening brings us into knowing each other more. And maybe that's where your enchantment is. Maybe the re-enchantment is in the deep listening. Maybe it's in the FaceTime that you haven't had in a good while. Maybe it's pausing for a moment to spend that rare moment that maybe when you have to go out for a moment to the grocery store, spending it with that child or that loved one that you've never had to spend time with. Maybe it has been the moment of where schools have been canceled and you have to make the artsy project and be a crafty kid. Maybe it's the moment where you've shared that old time record. Maybe you've spent time with your elders and reminisce. Maybe you visit them in the nursing home. Whatever it is, have a moment of re-enchantment. Don't forget that you're part of the magic of making everyone else around you and yourself more empowered, more creative, and making life worth celebrating. That is what it feels like when we have become re-enchanted. Don't forget, we're the magic.
Hi, everybody. Reverend Jim here. For the past month at our congregation, we've been focusing on the theme of wisdom. And today I want to talk briefly about some of the wisdom we have garnered through humanity about grief. There's been a lot of talk this past week in social media among my friends and in some news coverage about how we're experiencing grief at this time of change and pandemic and turmoil. And one of the things about grief is that we often think it's something that we experience after a loved one dies, which of course it is, but there are many other kinds of losses in our lives that can lead us to have feelings of grief. I want to show you a picture here as a sort of one example of a visual illustration of what grief might look like. I've often thought of grief as how something that happens when the bridge that you're going to take to the next part of your life is no longer there, and you have to find a different route. And as you can see in this picture, this sidewalk abruptly ends, and I feel like that's a symbol for what is happening to a lot of us right now. Some of us are experiencing relationships that are ending either because of distance or because of death. Jobs are coming to an end. Experiences that we were planning to have with family or friends, whether it's a graduation or a family reunion or even a wedding. Some of those things are not going to go as we had hoped. And so it's time for us to start thinking about what the alternate route is going to look like and time to build a new path. So there are different kinds of grief going on right now. There's anticipatory grief, which is a concept that often applies when someone we know is at the end of their life, and they're still with us, but we're anticipating the end, and we have feelings of grief that come before the actual ending. And I think we're having that in a lot of ways in our lives right now. And there's also a thing called an ambiguous loss, and I think a lot of us are also experiencing ambiguous losses. Ambiguous loss is a concept that was put forth by Pauline Voss, who is right now, she's a professor emerita at the University of Minnesota. She originally came up with ambiguous loss to describe either someone who is lost in a war or something like that, where there isn't a finality to the relationship. There's an ambiguous ending to it. She also used it to describe when we have someone who's in dementia in our lives, and they gradually fade away and become less themselves, but are still present. Again, there's a finality that isn't happening, and I think that's happening for a lot of people in their situations right now. There are a lot of people whose jobs have definitely ended, but there are a lot of people, for example, whose jobs may or may not come back. And the symptoms of grief can come up even if a loss is not final. Regardless of the kind of grief we're experiencing, I heard a great quote this past week from a psychotherapist out in California named Francis Weller, who said, "Grief is not a problem to be solved." And this is a concept I've tried to share in my ministry before, is that grief is not a mental health problem. Grief is not something unnatural. And grief is not usually something that can be solved by following stages exactly, or there's no precise route out of grief. And some of the writing you may have seen this past week about the stages of grief is acknowledging that they don't always happen in the right order. They don't, or the prescribed order, and they can come and go. And that the end product is not the elimination of grief, but rather a moving forward with grief. Because the losses we experience in these times will always be part of our story. And there's no going back and changing that. But there are ways that we can look at the grief, carry it with us, and move forward with greater acceptance of the new reality. So in these tender times, I ask us to be gentle with ourselves, be gentle with each other, as we are entering and continuing in a period of losses, unlike most of us have ever seen. And so please take care of your grief and your needs. And if you need anything from us at the congregation, be sure to give us an email or a call. Thanks.
Last week, I described the COVID-19 pandemic as a major social disjunction that is both widespread and long-term. The US hasn't experienced one since the Second World War. What we do know about major catastrophes is that societies survive and societies are profoundly changed by them, especially the generation that is at that time in young adulthood. The generation that emerged from the Second World War by and large trusted medicine and science. They believed in education. They believed that the federal government could fix large social problems such as poverty and racism. And they treasured social order and stability because they had personally experienced deprivation and wanton violence. That generation's ideas dominated American politics for a very long time. But slowly, other ideas arising from an extremist individualism and even a solipsism, began to spread. It consisted of an intertwined economic and social conservatism and a rise in right-wing religious thought. It throve on scientific skepticism, superstition, magical thinking, conspiracy theories, and American exceptionalism. Eventually, this disdain of community, of communally agreed upon observation and evidence and reason, went from a fringe movement to occupying the halls of American state and federal governments. That was then, a few short weeks ago. And the carnage caused by these changes is all about us. So what now? What good might arise from the social dislocation of this pandemic? How can we give it meaning? If the past is any guide, things are going to change a lot. Large dislocations always affect the young deeply, and I have a strong suspicion that today's young people have some lessons indelibly imprinted on their psyches. The first thing that may make a comeback is respect for reason and critical thinking. The value of evidence and the scientific method have been devalued for a long, long time. But when the very fabric of society is on the line, many have returned to experts who rely on evidence. All the magical thinking about fake news did not stop the predictions of science and medicine. Another fact that we knew intellectually, but perhaps didn't feel viscerally, is just how interconnected our planet is. One sick person anywhere can cause people all over the world to get sick. If this pandemic teaches us anything, it is that all of us, every human being alive on our planet, is connected, interdependent, our neighbor. And then there's the air that we breathe. People are seeing blue skies above the streets of Beijing for the first time in years. Those ugly brown domes of noxious pollution that hang over every major American city, those are floating away. And this demonstrates that we human beings really do control our destiny in terms of the environment. All we have to do is do what we already knew that we should be doing. Another thing that people will remember well is that flexibility is possible. We have changed whole institutions and industries essentially overnight. A phenomenon like this has not been seen since the existential peril of the Second World War. It's a lesson. Old ways can be changed very quickly. And perhaps the most graphic lesson for Americans is the social price we pay for having allowed the huge income disparities that we have developed in this country. The stats have long shown that many, if not most, Americans carry a crippling debt burden and live in desperation from paycheck to paycheck with minimal health care and little hope for a better future. The economic distress exposed by this pandemic is, I hope, enough to at least cause political action concerning an income disparity that has been widening every year since the 1970s. After all, with a snap of the finger, crippling student debt has been paused as a result of this pandemic. Could it be, I hope young people are asking themselves, could it be that the debt strangling their entire generation could go away exactly that quickly? This past week, we saw American government actually work with the most expensive and expansive legislation since the Second World War. It's not enough, but it's the first time such a thing has happened in 70 years and more. Things can change, and they can change quickly. Many Americans are going to remember that lesson, I think. This pandemic is our appointment with destiny, as President Franklin Roosevelt called it long ago. We can learn lessons from this experience, lessons such as that science and reason matter, that this planet is small and fragile, that we can change how we do things and how we live, and that as a nation, we can do big things, good things for the suffering of our fellow citizens. Past generations have learned from their tragedies, and we can too. We can grieve for what's lost, or we can determine to create a just society at last. We can weather this storm, rejecting fear and choosing life, an abundant life for all our neighbors on this small planet.
In these days that feel like time out of time, as grief gathers and anger mounts, still spring rain comes to make the grass green. The sound of bird song in the morning is a blessing to the ear. Still, we find simple and complex ways to show up as the change we wish to see in the world. It's not novel to say that every single issue that faces us as a society is worse for the poor, every single one. And when there is a huge societal displacement, as the novel coronavirus has caused, the marginalized are at ever greater risk. In yesterday's New York Times, an article referred to a white-collar quarantine. The current crisis highlights yet another way that our society is stratified between the haves and have-nots as we weather this social displacement. Our humanist values call us to be the ones who make a difference, and this physical distancing makes that especially difficult. We want you to know that there are ways to stay involved with our social justice work. Here are a few that I'm thinking about. Because you may have more time for reading, I suggest that you read your anti-racism and other literature that opens you up to points of view that are beyond the frame that makes white, middle-class, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied the only norm that you read. If we are only reading white, etc., novelists or writers, only reading white writers, then we're not well read. Now's a good time to expand our reading list. And even though libraries are closed, they're still available for ebooks and that sort of ability to access different literature. You can call and email your political representatives. Let them know what you're thinking. Now is a really good time to do that. Each week, our Active Voices group is continuing to gather now by Zoom, and they're putting together a Google Doc each week that lets us know what issues they're thinking about and also ways to contact our representatives. So check that out. You can find that link in each week's Friday email, and you'll see it also in the monthly newsletter. And if you'd like to join Active Voices, you may not have been able to before, but can now. Let us know that as well. Our climate justice group is continuing their work. And as of now, we're planning to go forward with our Turn Down the Heat presentation on Saturday, April 18th. It will be a time of learning, sharing, building capacity and community from no matter where we are. If you're eager to make a financial donation, either now or in the future, you may already know of places in great need. A few that I am thinking about are a couple of food shelves, which are in really getting a lot of increased activities. Groveland Food Shelf and the North Point Health and Wellness Community Food Shelf up on the north side. And the Immigrant Family Fund. Folks who are undocumented immigrants may be facing special burdens and hardships. They may not have access to health care, jobs may be curtailed, and they don't have the same access to resources that some of us do. So we'll put up the links for places that you can make donations, and the need will be great for a long time. So I'll keep presenting these places where we might be able to offer help. You know that one of my favorite closing readings, I share it a lot. You may know that this is especially poignant to me now, so I'll share it with you once again. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard, the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone.
Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.